So, as we begin chapter 5, we read the quote of the day. "We have it in our power to begin the world over again. A situation similar to the present hath not happened since the days of Noah until now. The birthday of a new world is at hand, and a race of men, perhaps as numerous as all Europe contains, are to receive their portion of freedom." Thomas Paine. So what do you think of that? Your book had a portion of this written into the chapter, but I think it is worth repeating again. Thomas Paine was extremely influential in the Revolution and pre-Revolution, and this quote really kind of exemplifies the thought pattern that was going on at this time, especially with those within the Enlightenment. So we see many things going on in the United States, or what was to become the United States during this chapter, or in this chapter. And so, as we begin, we talk about a fragile peace between 1750 and 1754. The ideas that were circulating within Britain and within Europe were circulating here. They were influential in how the colonists saw themselves and how they were going to deal with the promotion of liberty, as some were beginning to see it. But as you realize, the residents of the colonies were, as your book says, a most reluctant revolutionaries in 1776. So this fragile peace was especially fragile in the Ohio River, the Ohio Valley, because the valley was claimed by Virginia, Pennsylvania, France, the 6 nations of the Iroquois, plus the Indians who were living there. And in 1753, the French were building forts to keep out the British traders. In 1754, George Washington, as a 21-year-old surveyor, was sent out to ask the French to leave, because it was not their territory. He returned after they told him that they were not going to leave. So in 1754, he went back out with troops to drive out the French. Again, it didn't work. Washington apparently he shot the French leader, and as they were ending the battle, he signed a treaty saying that it was his fault that the officer had died, and he claimed that he didn't know the treaty said that. However, he said that his translator had explained it to him incorrectly. Regardless, he signed it, and the French used that in later times, saying that, hey, George Washington was out here, and the British were here, and they knew they were killing the leader, and he admitted to it. And so the French in 1754, they were winning the battle. George Washington signed the capitulation, and the British were driven back by the French and their Indian allies. And the French were used in that area by the natives, and also they were trying to keep the British out. But the British, understanding that there was no way they could take the Ohio, valley without their Indian allies went to them at the Albany Plan of Union. So this was a proposal for colonial consideration. George Washington and Thomas Hutchinson from Massachusetts were two of the proponents of this, to create a confederation, as it were, of the colonies so that they could keep the French out of their region. And so when they proposed it, they proposed a crown-appointed head of council, a ground council representing and funded by colonial assemblies. Now this was something different because it was creating this confederation of all of the colonies, who had previously, up until this time, had always considered themselves separate. There was, however, no colonial assembly approved by the plan. None of the plan did not work, and none of the colonies ratified the plan. So here's a copy of the actual document that Washington signed, where he admitted to killing the French officer. It's quite a controversy because he claimed that it was not true. And where they fought, where Washington fought, is what he named Fort Necessity. It's in what is now rural western Pennsylvania. And this is the actual size of the fort. It was recreated because everything was rotted. The men actually were fighting outside the fort. It was very crude, and also pretty small for that many men. So this building that they had was used to store the ammo and the supplies. And the fort itself was set in the middle of a natural meadow. There were several little streams that ran through it. So there was food for their horses and a water supply for both horses and men. And this is one of the cannons that was used at Fort Necessity, and some of the trenches that the soldiers fought from. These white signs show where the trees were at the time, and you can see the darker image here. That's where the creek ran, and a water supply is necessary for any type of area that troops are going to be stationed in. And after the run-in with the French, when George Washington killed the officer, or didn't kill the officer, this is where they came back. And then this is the Join or Die cartoon. This was written by, or created by Benjamin Franklin, and first published in his Pennsylvania Gazette on May 9th of 1754. And it represents New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. And the snake is significant because they believed, superstition believed, that if a snake was cut, it could return to the full snake length after dark. It would come back to life if the pieces were put together before sunset, actually. And so the colonists were divided on whether they should fight the French or not. And this was Benjamin Franklin's way of trying to convince people that the Albany Plan was a good thing, that they should fight the French, and so that they could expand. Okay, so the 7 Years' War was also known as the French and Indian War in the United States, and it really planted seeds of conflict between Britain and the colonies. King George's War had ended in 1748, but Britain and France weren't really happy with the results. They still wanted to defeat each other. And so Britain was aligning with Prussia, and really the war was fought in many, many places. So in 1754, the war started in North America over Washington and the run-in with the French in the Ohio Valley, which is, of course, still in what is now western Pennsylvania. So the natives that were fighting, the Huron, the Ottawa, the Nipissing, the Algonquin, the Shawnee, the Delaware, they were fighting with the French at Fort Necessity. In 1755, General Braddock came with 1,000 soldiers, and General Braddock thought that, and there was a reason that he thought this, but he thought that the British Army was the greatest army in the world, and that he should be able to effectively rout the enemy very quickly. Didn't quite happen that way. Braddock took 1,000 soldiers out, and 900 of them died, versus 23 French and Indian soldiers who died. He actually died in battle and was buried by George Washington in the road that they had built in order to get there. So there were seeds of resentment, and the British were trying to keep French expansion at bay. The French and native allies, however, were trying to curtail the encroachment of the British and keep them at bay. And so for 3 years they were able to keep the British at bay. But it also effectively kept all the colonies out of the European theater. And so there were quite a few defeats of the British by the French and their Indian allies. And it wasn't until 1758 when the Iroquois abandoned the French and other tribes all joined England to fight against Britain. That was really fight against the French. And that was the turning point in the war. Another turning point is when William Pitt took over in Britain, and he became a hero. Pitt understood that the colonists weren't going to fight for Britain, and he had to have, I shouldn't say that, they were going to fight for Britain on colony soil, but he needed more troops. And so by having all the troops here to fight the French and Indian War here, it meant that he had fewer troops in Europe where he needed them. So he came up with a brilliant plan that he was going to pay the cost of soldiers fighting the French and Indian War here in the colonies so that he could free up the British soldiers. With that, 40,000 troops were raised, which is way more than England had sent to fight the war. And so in 1758, they had won the West. In 59, they had won the North. And by 1760, Montreal had surrendered, and it ended resistance here on the American soil. And this is a map of the 7 Years' War. You can see the British, French, and disputed territory. Much disputed territory at this time. And so the British and French forts, you can see some of the forces and where they're headed. You can see Fort Necessity, Fort Duquesne, and just the overall area that they were covering. So in 1760, the end of French North America, basically the French, with the fall of Montreal in 1760, marked the end of the era with French. By 1762, they had entered into negotiations, and by 1763, the Treaty of Paris had been signed. Interestingly enough, there are over 30 treaties of Paris. And in 20 more years, 1783, will mark the end of the Revolution, the American Revolution, with another Treaty of Paris. With the Treaty of Paris, the French gave up all lands and claims east of the Mississippi River, except for New Orleans. Spain gave up Florida to gain Cuba. The Treaty of San Ildefonso was signed in 1762 because the French didn't want the Brits to have Louisiana, and the British didn't want the French to have Louisiana, so Louisiana went to Spain. So the Acadians in French America, in New France, were forcibly dispersed by the British, and if they wouldn't pledge an allegiance to the British crown. And so the majority of them ended up in Louisiana, really to become what we now know are the Cajuns. So between the King George's War and the French and Indian War, it strengthened this common identity of the colonists and Britain as British subjects, but it also added mutual misunderstandings and suspicion between the two. And so this Anglo-American friction, where officers and troops, officers and civilians, the British were mad at the colonists because the military expenses were being borne by the British and not the colonists, and it was being fought in the colonies. So the British subjects didn't appreciate that. The colonists also were making money off of the war. As with many wars, when you supply goods and services to a military, it increases your production and increases your profits. Concurrently, when that war ends, or when all those contracts end, your economy goes down, usually, right? And so the colonists, so the British were upset because the colonists had made money and they weren't paying extra money for the fighting. And the colonists were mad because they believed that because they had made all these consumer purchases previous to the war and the way the economy was, that the British were trying to keep them in debt, to keep this in order for them to keep up their lifestyle that they had become accustomed to, and they considered it enslaving the colonies. So both were, you can see the mistrust between the two. And King George didn't help because King George kept changing government frequently, which added to the tensions with the colonies. And the frontier tensions, you had, of course, the British and the French with the native allies. And so, without the French there anymore, the natives weren't able to play one off of the other. And they had done this for many years. They had played the British off the French off the British, and they would sometimes switch sides as to what was going to benefit them the most. So they did not see the British as friendly as the French in some ways, because they expected to become more of treated as British subjects now and not allies, and also sometimes seen as squatters because they were in the way. And so Neolin was a visionary who, in a vision, saw and convinced others in various native tribes that they needed to take the land back and live as they had before, especially as they had before the British were there. And so Pontiac's War in 1763 was fought in the Ohio and Great Lakes region, where 8 forts were sacked and 4 were besieged. There were lives lost on both sides, but ultimately the natives lost because there were food and ammo shortages. Smallpox had been spread, and some of it had been spread because the British had given the natives blankets with smallpox that had been infected with smallpox. And also the natives realized that the French just weren't coming back, and so they decided that it would be better to end the war. And the Proclamation of 1763 was declared by the King of England. And here's a map of the Proclamation of 1763. So George III wanted to have direct control of all the land transactions, settlement, trade, and other activities of non-natives west of this line of proclamation. And the line of proclamation, if you could look at a topographical map, you would see that it basically takes the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, except down there closer to Florida where it hooks back into the coast. And so what he was trying to do is seek control of the expansion that everyone was competing for. And then Indian land would have the titles west of the line until those tribal governments would cede land to Britain through treaties. This, of course, made the colonists very angry because it showed more imperial authority where they had previously negotiated with natives, but now there was no more negotiating directly with natives, and it slowed their expansion, and they were quickly expanding. Every map that you've seen just dramatic increases in the expansion and the territory that the different colonists have claimed. And in order to keep this line secure, King George had 10,000 soldiers stationed along the line. The colonists had to pay for those soldiers. So not only did they not like to pay for soldiers to begin with, but now they had to pay for soldiers to keep them out of lands that they really, really wanted. Alright, so the writs of assistance in 1760 and 61 were acts really about French West Indian trade and seizing illegal imported goods. So it was trying to shut down the smuggling. And there was evidence usually required, but the writs of assistance eliminated all evidence needed. So an official could go into any building, any ship, could go into homes, anywhere that they suspected that there might be smuggled goods. The colonists were appalled, and Otis went up and took it to court and claimed that it was against the Constitution, and thus it should be considered void. Chief Justice Tom Hutchinson from Massachusetts said no, because the same writs are being used in Britain. The important thing about the writs is that the colonists are challenging parliamentary authority, and they're doing it in court. And so Parliament considered that they, or thought that they could change laws at any time. They thought that the laws that they passed were part of the Constitution. Okay? What the colonists were claiming is that these are English rights, Englishmen's rights, and Parliament can't violate those rights. And one of the problems with both of these is that the Constitution wasn't a written document. And so you had some real issues there with parliamentary authority and the colonists really trying to go up against the parliamentary authority. And then you have the Sugar Act of 1764. That was a direct act in order to raise revenues. And they were raising revenues for the military, who was, of course, holding the, what's the line? The Proclamation. And so, what the Sugar Act did is it amended the Molasses Act of 1733, which taxed the West Indian rum and molasses. And it dropped the tax that had been 6 pence a gallon to 3 pence a gallon. Okay? And which seems like a great deal. But what the colonists had done is they had been bribing the customs officials to import the rum at 1.5 pence. Okay? So this was really to stop the bribery and to raise the revenues. So there was also a lot of new and complicated paperwork that wasn't merchant friendly, especially. And with the Sugar Act, there was no fair trial. The trials were in vice admiralty courts, which meant that the judges who voted in favor of the fact that it was either smuggled or not, but if they voted yes, or determined that yes, it was smuggled, they confiscated 5% of the cargo. So you could really make some money, right? And you could also change the venue. So if you had like John Hancock's sloop, the Liberty, they could have moved the trial to Halifax, Nova Scotia. They could have moved the trial to England, right? And the British Navy was heavy on the enforcement of the Sugar Acts. The colonists continued to smuggle the molasses and rum until 1766, when the British actually dropped it to a penny, which was less than 1.5 shillings. A penny is basically a shilling. So they dropped it to less than the normal bribe, and so they raised the they certainly raised the revenue then, because in 1763 they were making 1,800 pounds in revenue from the Navigation Acts. In 1766 they were making 30,000 pounds. But Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania were the hardest hit colonies for this act. And so after the Sugar Act wasn't raising enough money, and so the debt kept climbing, and the British subjects were paying the second highest taxes in Europe, while the Americans, the colonists, were paying hardly anything. So your British subject would generally pay about 26 shillings a person. Your British American subject was paying 1/2 to 1.5 shillings a person. So there's a huge gap there between the amount that people were paying in taxes. So you can imagine why the British subjects were thinking, hey, you know, they can pay some more. So in order to increase revenues, Parliament also implemented the Stamp Act in March of 1765. And the Stamp Act was very unpopular, as you can imagine, as were most of the acts that raised revenue. Right? Have you gotten that? Have you seen that theme? Okay. So the Stamp Act mandated that if you were going to use paper for any official documents like newspapers, it didn't even really have to be official, like if what we would consider today not official, a receipt from an inn for staying in an inn, that had to be stamped. You had licenses, all customs documents, playing cards, legal form like debtor forms, wills, even newspapers had to have the special stamped paper. And again, Vice Admiral Tweed courts, where there were no juries, just like the Sugar Act. But this act was an internal tax, and it was levied directly within the colonies. The Sugar Act was kind of it was external, because your merchants and the ship captains were really paying that, and they were passing the cost on. But the Stamp Act was, if I go to buy playing cards, I'm paying for the playing cards and the stamp right then. Okay, so it was more, it was like right there in your face, where you couldn't just kind of ignore it. It was something that every time you did something, it was like, it was, many colonists thought it was, it would be like a knife kind of twisting, right? There was a similar tax in Britain, and they were expecting revenues from 60 to 100,000 pounds, which would have paid 12 to about 20% of the military expenses. Never worked out that way. They never made that much money. And William Pitt had warned Grenville not to do this. William Pitt said, the colonists are not going to be happy. They already tax themselves. They've never paid revenue bills before. It's not going to work. And Grenville said, it's going to work, and we're going to do it. And he believed in virtual representation. Now, virtual representation is a really important concept. And what it means is that all members of Parliament represent all of the subjects in the British Empire, right? So, Parliament supersedes local ties and look for the good for all, right? And so Parliament would always have the highest authority. Now, the colonists saw their assemblies as similar and like as the legislative powers in the House of Commons, which is part of Parliament, right? Few people actually thought that Parliament really represented them. Virtual representation was a great theory, but Parliament really wasn't going to represent them. And they felt that they were more like Ireland. The colonies should be considered more like Ireland, where their own assemblies could tax, but they wouldn't interfere with British Parliament's laws on, like, commerce, okay? And this, of course, was quite different than what Parliament was thinking. And Parliament's laws were the highest in the land, and they said, no, all colonies are going to comply. And so the colonists, as being how they are, in 1765, decided to disagree publicly again. So Patrick Henry was one of the poster children of this, and he came up with 7 resolutions that would deny Parliament the power to tax colonies. Virginia and 7 more passed a portion of his resolutions. They toned it down a bit, but they were passing resolutions that agreed that Parliament could not tax the colonies. Okay, and here's a picture of a stamped journal. This is the Pennsylvania Journal and Weekly Advertiser. And if you look at it, at the top you can see a skull and crossbones. Skull and crossbones are like all over. They're on grave sites. They're on paper. It's just an interesting thing to see, because it's not something that you see today. It's not very common today. All right, this is more stamped paper. Even plays. If you had if you were producing a play, you had to use stamped paper. This is a New York protest to the Stamp Act, and it was printed in the Halifax Gazette. Now, newspapers were different in these days, and the newspapers would reprint articles and editorials from each newspaper. Most newspapers were weekly, and they had subscribers, but most of their subscribers really never paid what they were supposed to pay, but they still, there were advertisers, so it normally paid for the newspaper. But it was something that they did because it was harder to get the information out. Now, in today's society, you have instantaneous news, right? Not so in 1765. So this is another reason that they would copy it. And this, we, the underwritten retailers of goods, do hereby promise and oblige ourselves not to buy any goods, wares, or merchandise of any person, whoever that shall have shipped from Great Britain after the 1st day of January next, unless the Stamp Act shall be repealed. Okay, so they're starting to protest it, right? And then right after this is like a week later in the Halifax Gazette, is the stamp, but this is the anti-stamp stamp. So you have, again, the skull and crossbones with the border around it. And if you go back, here's the 1 penny stamp, the official 1 penny stamp. Okay? All right. And then you have an article here in the Pennsylvania Gazette on October 31st of 1765. And it's not assigned. Many of the letters to the editor were actually written by the editors themselves, but this one happens to not be signed by any of them. The Pennsylvania Gazette, of course, the printer of the Gazette was Benjamin Franklin, who was postmaster, and D. Hall was the other person. And so this is talking about the Stamp Act actually being unconstitutional. And then also in the Gazette you have another issue of the stamp. This is November 18 to 21 of 1765. And then December 12 to 19 you have the anti-stamp stamp. And so between one and the next one, you have the change in the stamps. Okay, the Loyal Nine. The Loyal Nine were the Boston artisans who were starting to really protest, especially in the large cities, and especially in Boston. And so Boston being the hardest hit from the Sugar Act, who was losing shipbuilding to these other ports. They were losing fishermen to the British Navy. They had a really high unemployment, and they were all paying a higher tax for the poor. So this distress, this economic distress, was leading to more angst. And throughout history, when you have a society or a town or a region where the economy is decreasing rapidly, and you don't have a lot of opportunity, you see this in general angst. You often see responses coming out of these areas, like revolutions. And so they were starting to blame the British officials and policies for Boston's hard economic times. And so the Sons of Liberty were born out of the Loyal Nine. There were different groups who were getting together and actually protesting and doing things. They started demolishing homes and warehouses. They attacked Lieutenant Governor and Chief Justice Tom Hutchison's home. They had already attacked the stamp distributor's home, who was actually related to Thomas Hutchison. He resigned, but Hutchison, had been voting, and he was the judge in several cases. He wasn't voting. He was the judge in several cases where judgments on the smugglers had come down. And so citizens were really seeing this royal policy equaling this bad economy. And so the Sons of Liberty grew out of this, out of these groups, and they were trying to mitigate the negative response of this mob, because it was a mob that was going through towns, these different towns, especially Boston, and burning things and destroying property. So the Sons of Liberty were focusing on the property and not the people, because they didn't want to alienate any elites who might support the Sons of Liberty and who might be opponents to the Stamp Act. So none of the people in the Sons of Liberty were able to carry weapons, and they generally had enough time for the people, the victims, to escape. So the Stamp Act Congress came about in October of 1765. 9 colonial assemblies were represented, and all agreed that Parliament lacked the authority to levy taxes outside of Britain, and they lacked the authority to deny a jury trial. So this tit for tat, this power struggle between the colonies and Britain continues. And so in 1765, the New York merchants were decided to boycott all British goods. Remember how much the colonies purchased from Britain? 40% of England's manufactured goods were purchased by the colonists. So if you weren't going to buy it, that's a tremendous hit to your economy in Britain. So the English went to Parliament and said, you know what, we're going to hit a recession, there's going to be massive unemployment, there's going to be political unrest, you need to repeal the Stamp Act. So along with the efforts of the merchants in Britain and the merchants here and the colonists here, Parliament decided to repeal it on the condition that the Declaratory Act was put into effect, and the Declaratory Act affirmed parliamentary power to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Okay? That's really important. In all cases whatsoever. Which would mean taxes, wouldn't you think? Which is, of course, the colonists didn't like. Okay. Well, the colonists said to themselves,